Well, Tom, it's I don't know. Watching the action there in Washington yesterday, I snapped back to a show I remember called The Bickersons. It's pretty interesting what's going on back there. This power play is, I don't know, it's getting old. I don't know what you're hearing in your office, but back here, a lot of folks are starting to get really tired of all that back there.
Oh, yeah, and this was discussed during the campaign, and the Democrats, of course, promised that they were going to tend to the problems of the country, and instead they've been obsessing almost exclusively on Donald Trump. And meanwhile, we're facing these enormous crises with the collapse of the southern border, the fact that we've got more than 100,000 people a month entering the country illegally. Those are the ones we know about. The rule of thumb is for every one we catch, there's two others that get through undetected. So it could be as many as 1/3 people illegally entering the country every single month. That is an appalling figure. And the only action the Democrats have taken in the House is legislation that we have just passed out of the Judiciary Committee, which basically extends amnesty to those who are currently in the country illegally.
Yeah, and we have another problem here, as I'm sure you already know, but the DMV now issuing out these official ID cards now that have a life longer than their legal status in the country.
Well, and that also goes back to California's sanctuary policy, giving driver's licenses to illegals. That's why California driver's licenses now have to be revamped according to the real ID requirements, so that the when you board a plane, that ID says you are legally entitled to be here.
Yeah. This seems to be chaos in every direction, Tom, and I don't know, maybe this is the way you fix things. Maybe if you cause enough craziness, it does eventually get fixed. We're all kind of hopeful that that's where this all winds up at some point.
Well, I mean, ultimately we have to deal with these problems, or they will end up dealing with us, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it does appear as though we're in this ultimate power play between at least two branches of government. And the third branch may wind up being dragged into it after all anyway, which is another technique that's used.
Yeah, and we do have to keep in perspective that the entire system was arranged for a natural tension to exist between the legislative and executive branches. They are each given their own competing spheres of influence. The legislative branch can make law but cannot enforce it. The president can enforce law but cannot make it. And that by itself creates a natural tension. We've seen that from the very founding of the country. It was pointed out recently that the first president to invoke executive privilege was George Washington. I think it's been invoked by almost every president since then. So nothing new there. And I do agree with you that when disputes cannot be resolved between the two branches, the legislative and the executive, and the third branch, the courts, are brought into it. You hear the term constitutional crisis thrown around so cavalierly. To me, a constitutional crisis is a dispute that cannot be resolved by our constitutional institutions, and we're far from that point yet.
Tom, some states now are trying to throw out the electoral college process. That's going to be, I'm assuming and hoping that it's impossible. But is there concern about it now that we have, I think, 12 states that are actually trying to throw this thing up in the air and shoot at it?
I'm concerned about it because it's an end run around one of the most fundamental mechanisms of our Constitution. And that mechanism is mimicked by the arrangement of the Congress. The House of Representatives represents the people evenly by population, evenly across the country. The Senate, though, is there to represent the states, to assure that the concerns of less populated rural areas have to be taken into account in the formulation of national policy. And by the way, you can see that playing out in California very clearly with the State of Jefferson movement. As you know, the State of Jefferson movement is a group of counties in Northern California and in southeastern Oregon that feel that they have been completely ignored by their state legislatures. Both houses of the legislatures, unlike the Congress, have been apportioned strictly by population. So the states tend to be controlled. California tends to be controlled by the voting blocks in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and they couldn't care less about the inland counties, and they reflect that in their policy, which is creating enormous tension in California and in Oregon. The Electoral College and the Senate were specifically designed to compromise and modulate that tendency, and so that's what the left is trying to tear down when they're going after the Electoral College.
Well, and I noticed that one of those states, like yesterday, was Nevada, and they're absolutely in the pocket you just talked about.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Is the left is taking over some of these governments because voters are letting it. I mean, let's face it, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Voters are voting that way. And what they will end up with is a very permanently divided country between the rural areas and the urban areas, with the urban areas dictating policy to the rural areas. Again, the way we've arranged our government is to prevent that from happening, or at least to moderate the worst influences of that from happening. That's what the left wants to tear down, and that's what they're tearing down when they go after the Electoral College.
Now, to change that, it's a constitutional change, right? Which would mean the majority.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Yes, it should be a constitutional change. What's going on right now is a compact among the states saying that we don't care how the people of Nevada vote. If a majority of all of the states in this compact vote a certain way, even though it's the opposite of what Nevadans have voted for, we're going to vote the same way as the other states in the Electoral College and ignore the will of the voters of Nevada. Now, there are two big problems with that would have to survive court challenge. This is why I do think it's going to ultimately collapse. Number one, the Constitution says that any interstate compact has to be approved by the Congress before it can take effect. Congress has not approved this interstate compact. The other thing is the Constitution clearly guarantees to every American the right to live in a little r Republican form of government. For a state to pass a law that says your vote doesn't count, your vote for president will be determined not by the majority of voters in your own state. It'll be determined by a majority of voters in another state. That, I think, you can make a very strong case, denies the voters, in this case of Nevada, of their right to Republican representation.
So, Tom, the mission is we get all this energy focused on the border, and I guess that problem could be solved in a few minutes, right?
Well, there are several issues that are involved, but it fundamentally comes down to we're not enforcing the immigration laws we already have. And a second problem, and that is that our asylum laws have a loophole in them that are allowing this massive wave of illegal immigration to make a mockery of them. The way the law is currently arranged, if somebody can bring a kid across the border who is not a resident of Mexico and simply claim that they are fleeing persecution, it can be a complete line. In most cases, it is. I mean, asylum is reserved for those who have specifically been targeted by their government for persecution. You're a member of a religious group, for example. The government has targeted you for persecution. That is a valid asylum claim. What we're seeing, though, is hundreds of thousands and over time millions of people illegally crossing our border simply because they live in an impoverished country and they want to come to the United States where there's lots of free stuff. And I'm sorry, but our asylum laws do not. There are 7.5 billion people on this planet. Most of them live in countries that are plagued by violence and poverty. That does not give every one of them the right to come to our country, and that's what they're doing. And when they cross the border, they are cited. They claim asylum. Then the law requires they be released into the United States pending a court hearing to determine whether their claims are bogus. Well, guess what? Over 90% of them don't appear in court. They simply disappear into the American interior, and I think that all of the acts that the House Democrats are now doing, promising new amnesties, new asylums, I think that's going to compound the problem because it's encouraging more and more people to cross illegally into the United States. That's what's got to be solved.